You're listening to In Good Health, the trusted news source for medicine, science, and technology. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
I'm Mayan Vasta Betancourt.
And I'm Greg Johnson. This week, revealing the lasting effects of childhood sexual abuse.
These girls were just really devastated. They got re-victimized as adults. Several of the children born to our original children died as a result of abuse. We just watched this terrible thing cascade from generation to generation.
But first, the thin line between total devotion and religious OCD.
This is my relationship with God, and that's a spiritual thing. And this is also my brain, which is a real organ that's sitting inside my head. And it needs treatment. It doesn't necessarily just need to kneel down and pray harder.
All that and more this week on In Good Health. There are many medical conditions that are misrepresented in popular media, a prominent one being obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Though it's often portrayed as the need for cleanliness, Dr. Emily Bailey says it's much more debilitating than what Hollywood usually shows.
OCD is really characterized by obsessions and compulsions, obsessions being unwanted intrusive thoughts that cause distress, cause anxiety, and then this compulsive piece where they're engaging in some sort of behavior to reduce the anxiety that the obsession causes.
Bailey is a clinical psychologist who treats a subtype of OCD called scrupulosity, also known as religious OCD. While it can happen to anyone, even people who don't identify with any faith, this type of OCD creates guilt or obsession around moral issues.
Oftentimes when people come into therapy and they're presenting with scrupulosity OCD, they're asking questions and really concerned about intrusive thoughts related to what if I sinned? Am I praying correctly? Did I offend a higher power? What if I did something and that's going to result in an undesired afterlife? And so scrupulosity is really asking these unanswerable questions that cause distress, right? And they come to us often not even knowing that this is their diagnosis, like what OCD is, because so often people are trivializing OCD to be just about cleanliness. So this is a completely different subtype that's really not fully understood. But the obsessions center around, am I practicing my religion in a way that I should be?
Notice how Bailey didn't single out just one religion? That's because OCD doesn't discriminate. But while it can happen in any type of faith, she has noticed that many of her own patients come from rule-driven religions, such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Another assumption people make is that scrupulosity is a product of religious trauma, but that's the opposite of the truth in many cases. Jaimie Eckert, for example, had a very positive experience growing up in the Christian faith.
It appealed to me, the idea that there was a God who had created me and had a purpose for my life. And that was just something that I found very heartwarming. And it drew me even to make my own decisions I attended a conservative Bible college afterwards, which was my choice. Like, I was just a very naturally spiritual child. And again, most of it, I think for me, was a genuine and sincere and positive experience that only later got hijacked by OCD. Because, OCD attacks whatever you love the most. Many people that I've talked to that have this, they say this is the worst kind of OCD because it's attacking what is so central to who we are as people.
Religious OCD latches onto your existing beliefs, then twists and amplifies them to the extreme.
Compulsion can look different, especially depending on what people present with. But one of the most common ones that I see is excessive prayer. So praying upwards of 15 plus times a day, asking forgiveness multiple times a day. Sometimes it involves confessing sins or behaviors that are thought to be sins. It can also actually include avoidance. So sometimes people come to me and they're actually avoiding all places of religion or reading religious text because they don't want to be triggered, right? They don't want to have to start doing even more compulsions or pray excessively or seek reassurance compulsively, right?
The signs of scrupulosity can be difficult to recognize because many faiths praise this type of devotion. However, Bailey says the line between healthy and unhealthy is drawn when it starts to negatively influence your life.
The differentiation can be difficult, but I think one of the biggest things is, does practicing your religion interfere with living your life in other ways? Does it interfere with your work? Does it interfere with your relationships, right? Your romantic relationships, your friendships? Does it cause you to stress? That's another really big component. if you feel fear or distress when practicing your religion, then the likelihood is that you may be engaging in a compulsion.
Sadly, it took Eckert years before she would realize this difference. Her OCD first began to creep in during her college years.
I would get these impressions about what I had to wear, what I could or couldn't eat, when did I need to abstain from eating. Even the quote unquote God voice was telling me who I had to marry, and of course it's somebody that I could never imagine myself being with. So I'm like, no, God, I don't want to do that.
But if that's what God wanted, that's what Eckert believed she had to do, even though she couldn't imagine a happy future with this man. Though she was eventually able to overcome this compulsion, all of these thoughts became demanding and oppressive, very unlike the God she had grown up knowing her whole life.
My understanding of God was very healthy and full of grace and very positive, and yet my day-to-day experience just started to landslide into this really strange concoction of all of these impressions that seemed like God was telling me to do things, even to the point, like when I say micromanaging, even to the point of like, I'd get impressions that if I was going from the cafeteria to the admin building, I had to walk this way instead of that way, like I would have to go the longer way. And I'd be like, well, why, God? Well, I don't know, but the impression was there. And I had to follow it because maybe something bad would happen to me, or maybe God was testing me to see if I was really in tune with his voice. And if I wasn't in tune with his voice, then what did that mean for my salvation?
These continuous thoughts began to snowball into larger questions and doubts that would get stuck in Eckert's head. Does God exist? Is my religion the true faith?
I felt like if I don't figure out these answers, my whole life is on the line. A big one for me was, whether or not God actually exists. If God doesn't exist, my whole faith is meaningless. So, why am I even bothering with all of this? I would hole myself up in my dorm room for 8 hours at a time, listening to apologetic sermons about the existence of God or salvation and things like this. And it would just make me feel so good. But then a few weeks later, I would feel the need to revisit it again and reassure myself again that those answers were correct for me.
These compulsions continued to persist, even after college when Eckert and her husband moved to the Middle East to work as missionaries.
I was working with refugees, so I had a lot of compassion fatigue going on. I had a lot of pressure on me constantly. And I had had some circumstances occur in my professional life that felt like a failure to me. And because my work was related to my religion and my church, and I worked for a church organization, it felt like if I fail professionally, I'm actually failing God.
It was during this mission trip that Eckert had a mental breakdown that included severe clinical depression and suicidal ideation. The couple moved back to America to get her help. Eckert came across the term religious OCD through a Google search and identified with it immediately. She was able to get an official diagnosis and finally receive professional help to treat the thoughts that had been torturing her for years.
The clergy don't know what to do with this. They tell you, pray harder, pray harder, pray harder, and that's going to backfire on you. The secular psychologists tend to, have a more secular approach, which I can tell you, I have so many people in my support group that have just fled from therapists, which is so sad because they're afraid that therapy is going to make them deny God. It's going to make them sin. It's going to, just push them further away from the Lord. So it is a really complicated, and I don't think any of us have perfect answers to what to do with this. But one of the things that's just been helpful for me is recognizing this is two things at once. This is my relationship with God, and that's a spiritual thing. And this is also my brain, which is a real organ that's sitting inside my head. And it needs treatment. It doesn't necessarily just need to kneel down and pray harder.
Bailey says a lot of providers either don't know how to treat religious OCD or they miss the signs altogether. And since the illness is so intertwined with someone's faith, there's a big fear that the choice is either to be healthy or keep their faith. So many just don't seek treatment. However, Bailey says that scrupulosity treatment is not at all an attack on the patient's religion.
The goal is to actually bring you closer to your faith and practice faith in a way that aligns more with your faith community and with the tenets of the faith. I always say that OCD has a very intense way of hijacking our faith and making us believe we have to do X, Y, and Z to be, a Christian, for example. That's not the case. The goal, what we really want to do is just provide them with the ability to do whatever people in their community do as a part of their normal faith practice.
And this is achieved through exposure and response prevention.
And it essentially involves exposing an individual to situations that they fear, and then using response prevention while being exposed. So what does response prevention mean? That means we're not going to allow you to engage in the compulsion, or we're going to reduce the compulsion in some way. Now, that sounds really scary, and I recognize that that sounds very intense, but patient and provider really at the beginning work collaboratively to not only understand what OCD is and how this is OCD, but we really work to lay out what would be the least distressing situation that you could possibly put yourself in where we could fight OCD just a little bit, right? We're going to gradually start exposing them to things they fear rather than throw them into the deep end of the pool without any floaties.
This helps the patients learn to tolerate anxiety and realize that they can get through the uncomfortable feelings without needing to act on the compulsion.
OCD doesn't care about their faith. OCD cares about OCD. So we may ask patients to do things like pray less. And that feels like that is the least religious thing you can do. But if you're coming from a place where you're already excessively praying and you're only communicating with your higher power out of fear, then we don't want that. We don't want to ever interfere with the relationship with God or a higher power, but we do want that connection to be meaningful and be comforting, not driven by fear.
Since the goal is to heal the OCD while keeping the faith intact, Bailey's an advocate for having a faith leader be present for this journey so that they're also able to pinpoint normal practices from OCD-driven ones.
You don't have to pick like your health or your mental health over your religion. It's hard work, but I think it's so valuable. It's such a protective factor. Religion is so important in people's lives. I would never ask somebody to leave their faith just because OCD got hard. There's so much you can overcome.
You can find more information about Dr. Emily Bailey, Jaimie Eckert, and all of our guests on our website, ingoodhealthpodcast.org. For more behind the scenes, follow In Good Health on Facebook, Instagram, and X. This segment originally aired September 2024. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farrah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
Coming up, how childhood trauma ages our organs, when In Good Health returns. This segment discusses the sexual abuse of young girls and the lasting effects of that trauma. While we believe this is an important topic, it may not be suitable for some audiences. Though Dr. Frank Putnam didn't set out to specialize in child abuse, he quickly realized that's where he was needed. Not because he was better suited than any other psychiatrist, but because very few were willing to take it on. Putnam dedicated his career to revealing the scars this trauma carves into the minds and bodies of victims. Today, he's recorded his life's work in his new book, Old Before Their Time, a scientific life investigating how maltreatment harms children and the adults they become.
A lot of people would say, doesn't this make you depressed? And my answer really has always been, no, it makes me angry. And I've really drawn on that side of it. This is wrong. This is bad. This is evil. This is a crime. This is terrible. You got to do something about it. It's not a good news book, which is a kind of a sad thing. You know, all the time I was writing it, I really struggled with how much do I put in? But the other side of it is just, you got to tell the truth. And it's a devastating experience.
An experience that Putnam says is often even worse than most people think. Putnam is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. He's one of the originators of the Female Growth and Development Study, one of the longest-running studies of the impacts of childhood sexual abuse. It started in 1987, following around 80 girls who had experienced this trauma.
They were ages 6 to 15, and that had to do with our wanting to span puberty. And then we followed these children for 8 times into middle age at this point. We're still in touch with them, and we're still following them. And in fact, we have 2 more papers in press that are looking at adult out results. The study is focused around the biology, the effects on the biology, particularly certain hormonal systems like the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal process, which has to do with stress. It's the cortisol hormone that people hear about. It's adrenaline. Also the HPG, hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And so we looked at a lot of what they call sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, androstenedione, those sorts of things.
To get a baseline, the researchers matched each participant with a non-abused girl who had the same age, race, and family socioeconomic status. This comparison controlled for powerful factors that can alter life outcomes so that the study could focus on the effects of abuse. In addition to looking at how it impacts puberty, Putnam and his colleagues followed numerous other areas of their health, a taboo endeavor for the time. Putnam received heavy pushback from others in the medical field for even considering that this trauma has a biological impact. Thankfully, he stood his ground and used the female growth and development study to prove that sexual abuse in childhood has much more devastating effects than anyone was aware of.
We're looking at changes in the sort of puberty in terms of how fast they mature. We're looking at changes in their maturation of their stress response system. We're looking at changes in their immune system. We're looking at also cognitive development was pretty significantly impaired in these girls. And none of them ever got a four-year college degree. A few of them got two-year degrees compared to our comparison girls who were out of the same socioeconomic class, had the same sort of minority distribution, et cetera, who did pretty well generally. These girls were just really devastated.
The abused group also experienced more jail time and domestic violence later in life.
They got re-victimized as adults. So there was a cumulative trauma burden that went along with this also. And several of the children born to our original children died as a result of abuse. At least 3 died as a result of the offspring. So, we just watched this terrible thing cascade from generation to generation.
While they don't have nearly as much data on the new generation as they do the original girls, Putnam says they've noticed a distinct pattern of behavioral problems.
Pretty much they're replicating their parents' course. And this is one of the things that really emerges out of all of our studies looking at the 3 generations, is how much this is an intergenerational process and how trauma in one generation is transmitted as risk for trauma in the next generation, and so on. If you look at in the book, there's a figure that shows you how often the mothers of our abused girls were themselves sexually abused as children, and it's almost all of them, whereas it's relatively rare experience in the mothers of the comparison girls.
Putnam believes having a parent who is abused is the single greatest risk factor for a child's abuse.
It increases likelihood of substance abuse. It increases likelihood that you're going to have a partner who is also abused, which is another risk factor. It increases the fact that there's more likely to be domestic violence in the home. It leads to a whole host of other things that increase the risk for maltreatment of that child. Often it's not the mother who was abused who is maltreating the child. It's that they associate with people who do abuse the child, and they take advantage of kind of a failure to protect their children. These mothers often are not as vigilant as other mothers in terms of protecting their children from abuse. It's a paradoxical thing, and it feels like blaming the victim a little bit, but it's also something that's been found not just in our study, but in other studies.
When addressing the initial pushback Putnam received to his idea on how trauma creates biological changes, he notes that part of the issue is many people think of this abuse as a one-time experience.
What people don't understand is that this is a hugely cumulative experience that goes on and on. It crosses all these developmental stages. It's a time when the child is both developing psychologically, but also developing physiologically. And it has impacts on both of those kinds of lines of development. And I think that's one thing that the media doesn't really take into account, how much this is a chronic situation for these children. Point I would make is that we found the average child in our study had been abused between 100 and 200 times. Okay, that's massive. It's not just a one-time thing. It's something that happens to them all the time. It stresses them continuously. Even when they're not being abused, they're anxious about when is the next, going to happen. because most of these kids were abused within a family context. And so they were always, in a sense, vulnerable. There was no safe place for them.
Today, the biological effects of trauma are widely accepted as true thanks to research like Putnam's. However, there continues to be issues with people accepting that abuse is happening.
As an advocate, often when I talk to people, they often, who would do that to a child? I can't imagine anybody would do that. So there's a group of people that it's just an unimaginable experience.
The reality, though, is that thousands of kids each year know exactly what type of person would do that to a child. Despite our knowledge on how prevalent this abuse is, Putnam says there's still a lot of neglect, both in society and in the legal system. Join us next week as Putnam discusses his firsthand experience with this dismissal and how he can break these cycles of abuse. His book, Old Before Their Time, is available now wherever books are sold. You can find more information about Dr. Frank Putnam and all of our guests on our website, ingoodhealthpodcast.org. For more behind the scenes, follow In Good Health Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farrah. Our production manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Greg Johnson.
In Good Health returns in just a moment.
Medical notes this week. Too much of a popular supplement could be setting the stage for unexpected birth defects. A study published in Frontiers in Cell and Developmental Biology warns that high doses of common antioxidants, like NAC, can negatively alter sperm DNA. In mouse models, this change led to differences in the offspring's skull and face shape. Even when the father appeared perfectly healthy, his high intake of antioxidants resulted in female offspring with smaller skulls and closer-set eyes. NAC is a key ingredient in many multivitamins, so it's important to pay attention to how much you're ingesting past the recommended daily amount. The deadly drive to restrict food may have biological roots. According to a study published in Cell Reports, there are 2 specific subregions in the brain that drive anorexia. By destroying specific neurons in animal models, the team was able to prevent self-starvation and excessive exercise typical of the disorder. This breakthrough reveals that therapies for anorexia need to focus on multiple areas of the brain to be effective. Treating pain with fewer side effects. Research published in Nature Communications has identified a specific receptor that triggers pain without inflammation. By blocking this receptor in animal models, the scientists were able to reduce pain while still allowing inflammation to heal the area. This finding could revolutionize the way conditions like arthritis are treated. And finally, would you eat fish-flavored ice cream? Scientists have developed a synthetic version of the proteins found in the blood of polar fish. They're designed to prevent ice crystals from forming, which cause freezer burn and destroy delicate biological structures. A study published in Advanced Materials proves that the synthetic proteins are non-toxic and heat-stable. It offers a new way to extend the shelf life of complex medicines without the need for toxic chemicals or actual fish. And that's Medical Notes this week. I'm Mayan Vasta Betancourt.
Thank you for joining us this week and every week as we break down the science stories you need to know. You can find all of our past segments and guests on our website at ingoodhealthpodcast.org or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and X for more behind-the-scenes content. Tune in next week for another edition of In Good Health.